Okay, I believe I was muted and I started speaking. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's second time round starting. Um, I'd like to welcome you all to the second in our webinar series. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome from the Children's Institute, as well as the South African Medical Research Council, Gender and Health Research Unit, and Sonke Gender Justice as our partners in this webinar series. I'm delighted to be sharing the afternoon with you, and just to say that this is the second in our seminar series. We started last week with a really interesting seminar and looked at starting to unpack the intersections of violence against women and violence against children, and really importantly, Merceline Machiza from the Medical Research Council shared her research on looking at pathways between violence during childhood and later perpetration, as well as victimization. An important conversation ensued last week and exploring the mental health impact of violence early on in childhood and the impact it has later on, and the need for interventions to be focusing on mental health. Today we're taking a bit of a different trajectory, but also delving deeper into understanding intersections on violence against women and violence against children, but more importantly also starting to unpack what are the opportunities as well as challenges of integrating the two approaches. The other area of work that we're also wanting to look at is starting to think about what are the global frameworks that's promoting violence prevention, so frameworks like Inspire and Respect, as well as starting to think about what are some of the tensions between in working and trying to integrate these two sectors in terms of violence against women and violence against children. So I'm hoping that you can all stay with us for the afternoon, and it's going to be really interesting. Before I introduce the speakers to you, I just want to cover some of our housekeeping for this afternoon. So wanting to say that we want to try and keep it quite interactive, and we're wanting to try some technology this afternoon. So we're going to do a poll, but you've got to bear with us. It's the first time we're doing it, so we might get it horribly wrong. So just, we're going to take it quite slowly. And then once we've done the poll, what we will do is then move into our panel discussion. First on the agenda, we will have Alessandra Guedes, and we won't go through the bios right now, but just to say that we'll have our two panelists, and then right at the end, what we will do is to have a Q&A. What I will encourage you through this afternoon is to put your questions in the chat throughout the afternoon. So as you have questions for the panelists, put it into the chat, and what we will be doing is to answer some of the questions in our Q&A session after the presentations. Also would like to encourage you to engage with social media, and some of the hashtags we will put it into the chat so that you can also be using social media to be promoting some of the messages we're putting out today. So we're going to try the poll now. So as you can see, we're using slido.com, and so what you will need to do is to go to that website and to enter the code, and you will be taken through the poll. So we will be giving you a few minutes to do that. So bear with us, and I'm not sure if you're able to do that. We'll see, and we'll give you a few moments to just ensure that you're able to enter your poll answers. And we'll give the answers we'll actually give the poll results after the first presentation. Hi, good. We're back live. Just to say that we've got our poll results in. Lwazi, do we want to go back to the first poll result? So the first question we asked you was, children are not affected by violence between adults in the home when they don't see it, and you could either agree or disagree. And 94% of participants this afternoon disagreed with the statement. Shall we look at the second poll question, Lwazi? So the second poll question asks, women who are abused by a partner should leave the abuser to protect their children. And 89% of participants agreed with that statement. Oh, it's just moving as we're talking, it's changing all the time. So 91% of the audience agreed that women should leave the abuser. And the last question we asked was, children should be removed from their home if their mother is experiencing abuse. Now, it seems as if this question was not answered. Lwazi? Perhaps we can get back to the last poll. Oh, here we go. So, children should be removed from the home if their mother is experiencing abuse. 39% of participants agreed, while 61%, so just under 2/3, disagreed with the statement. Okay, really interesting results, and I think Alessandra will pick up on some of it. So shall we move over to the next part of our webinar, and that's to our panelists. So let me introduce our panelists for this afternoon. So we've got an exciting panel with 3 panelists on the panel this afternoon. First up, we have Alessandra Guedes, who is well known to most of you. Alessandra has been dedicated her 20 years of her professional life to promoting children and women's rights and health, including work intensively to end violence against children and women. She joined Innocenti, the research office, UNICEF's research office in 2019 to lead the development and implementation of a research program to address key issues and constraints to achieve gender equity within child protection, with a focus on addressing the interlinkages between violence against children and violence against women. Prior to joining UNICEF, Alessandra served at the WHO's regional advisor for the Americas on family violence prevention for 10 years. She is still co-chair of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, or SVRI as we know it, and she continues to occupy that position. Over to you, Alessandra. I'll introduce Liz and Anik when they're up for their presentation. So shall I hand over to you?
Thanks so much, Shanaz. And I'm just sharing my screen, and I will need some help just to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Give me just 1 second. Can you see my screen, the presentation? No? Okay.
Not yet, but maybe other people can. Yes, we can.
You can? Okay.
Correct.
Let me just get through, and just so you know, everyone, I will not be able to see the chat as I'm presenting because I'm going to make this bigger. So if you need to interrupt me, or I don't know how you're going to be able to do that. So hopefully we'll be okay. So thanks so much, Shanaz, for the introduction, and also for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. Thanks to all of you who are joining us. And also thanks to the tech team at the University of Cape Town. It's such a luxury to be able to have such a great group of people working with us. So as Shanaz mentioned, I've worked for over 20 years in the field of violence prevention, and I actually came to it from the sexual and reproductive health and rights, starting with violence against women, and then within the last 10 years or so, including the work on violence against children. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how these forms of violence intersect, how inspire and respect the two global frameworks that we're using to frame our interventions on violence against children and violence against women relate to each other. And then I'm just going to very briefly mention some of the work that we're doing here at UNICEF Office of Research, Innocenti, which is based in Florence, Italy, which is where I'm coming to you from today. So I think that those of us who have been working in this area will recognize that these are fields that for a really long time were developed in quite separate ways, and oftentimes in parallel ways. And it's important to acknowledge that these are fields that have been traditionally underfunded, particularly when we think about the magnitude of the prevalence of violence against women and violence against children. And these are also fields that are highly political. I would say both of them, but perhaps violence against women more so. And I often think about, what has led us to have some of these tension points or to not join forces earlier. And at least one of the reasons, I think, is that we come to these issues with very passionate ideas. We have very strong feelings about the work that we do, and that makes us, I think, great advocates for the cause, but sometimes it makes it a little bit more challenging to listen to diverse points of views and to find common ground. And occasionally the agenda of protecting children and the agenda of protecting women come into points of conflict or tension at least, and I'm going to explore that a little bit. And we have concerns, for example, around, if we integrate violence against children, will that undermine violence against women? Because usually when you put children's needs and women's needs next to each other, not always, but oftentimes, women lose out. And so this has led to these separate advocacy, research, and programmatic and policy efforts that have not necessarily served us well. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the evidence of how these forms of violence intersect, what are some of the opportunities that we have for collaborating, some of the tension points, and finally a little bit of the work at UNICEF Innocenti that we're doing to try to bridge these gaps. So let me see if I can figure this out. Yes. So a couple of years back, Manuela Colombini, Sarah Bosch, and Claudia Garcia Moreno and I did a review of the evidence globally around the points of intersections between violence against women and violence against children. And we came up with these different intersections that I'm going to use to frame the evidence that I'm going to share very briefly because of time limitations, but then I will share with you the full reference for the paper if you want to read more about it. So they include shared risk factors, and within that, social norms. They include the fact that oftentimes these forms of violence co-occur in the same families, in the same households. We also find that, as I understand you explored last week's in last week's webinar, exposure to one form of violence may increase your risk of experiencing or perpetrating another form of violence. The fact that these forms of violence often result in similar consequences. And finally, we'll look a little bit at the adolescence age group, which seems to get lost between the fields of violence against children and violence against women. In terms of shared risk factors, we've seen more and more research looking at this and trying to identify what are the risk factors that can lead to both perpetration of violence against women and violence against children. And what we find is that gender inequality and discrimination, the lack of responsive institutions, weak legal sanctions against both forms of violence, male dominance in the household, marital conflict, certainly the harmful use of alcohol and drugs, and early exposure to violence. These are all risk factors that we find to be associated with both the perpetration of violence against children and violence against women. And social norms are one of these risk factors, and this has been teased out a little bit more, including there's a relatively recent report from colleagues at the London School of Hygiene that explore this even in more detail that I'm providing you here. But we find, for instance, that there's an overlap in people who think that wife beating and corporal punishment of children are acceptable and in some cases necessary. We also have social norms around the idea of masculinities as based on violence and control. Certainly the prioritization of family reputation often over the needs of survivors and victims, and the blaming of victims for the violence that they experienced is something that we see in both violence against children and violence against women. And of course, gender inequality being at the root of both of those forms of violence oftentimes. In terms of co-occurrence, it's really interesting because traditionally we have looked at co-occurrence as both forms of violence occurring in the same family and oftentimes at the same time. And so what we find is that children in households where women are experiencing abuse are more likely to experience violent discipline. But one of the things that I'll tell you a little bit more about later on is that we're looking at some data from Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're starting to conceptualize co-occurrence not just as happening within the same time frame, but what we find, for instance, is that women who have experienced violence in their past, intimate partner violence in their past, we still find an association with how children in that household are punished in violent ways. So it doesn't necessarily mean that both forms of violence are happening at the same time, but one predisposes children in the household to experience the other, even if they're not at the same time. So I'm going to share a little bit of the data from a different part of the world, which is the part of the world that I'm more familiar with, Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is based on mostly demographic health surveys, which are nationally representative surveys, primarily focused on sexual and reproductive health, but many of them have included a module on violence against women. So what we're looking here is the percentage of women who report experiencing intimate partner violence during pregnancy. And the reason why we are looking at this is twofold. One is to make the point that this interaction of violence against children and violence against women starts quite early. And the second point that I want to make is to raise our awareness that, we often think of pregnancy as a period of protection that offers protection to women who may be experiencing violence, but we find that not to be the case. And so when we're thinking about prenatal care services, it's really important for us to be trying to identify women who may be experiencing violence, certainly for their own safety and well-being, but also because that will have an impact on the babies that they're carrying. So you see that the prevalence ranges from about 4% in Panama all the way to almost 10% in Colombia. And then when we look here, this is the work of colleagues from the World Health Organization and the London School of Hygiene and the Medical Research Council of South Africa, looking at what are some of the consequences of experiencing intimate partner violence during pregnancy. And certainly you have a number of consequences that not only impact women, but impact their pregnancy and their children. So alcohol and drug abuse during pregnancy, smoking during pregnancy, delayed prenatal care, which have consequences in terms of birth weight, preterm delivery, often unsafe abortions or miscarriages. And again, the point being that experiencing violence during pregnancy has impacts on birth outcomes in children down the line. So that interaction starts quite early. Also looking at intergenerational effects, but a bit further down the line. So what we're looking here is the prevalence of physical and or sexual intimate partner violence according to whether the survivors was beaten. So the dark columns, we see women who reported that their mother or their stepmother was beaten. So in theory, they were witnesses, even if they did not see that violence, they knew that their mother or their stepmother was being beaten. And the light columns are women who did not report that their mother was beaten. And what we find is a strong association through which if I lived in a household where my mother or stepmother was being abused, I have a much higher likelihood of experiencing physical or sexual intimate partner violence when I become an adult. And this association was statistically significant and held for all of the countries that we looked at. And there's more data in terms of the intergenerational impact, including, for instance, whether women are experiencing IPV and how children in the household are punished, for instance, showing a strong correlation between the experience of IPV and children in a household being violent and disciplined. Although we're just now starting to understand who is doing the disciplining, and we can't for sure say that it's the mother or the father. In other words, is it the father who's beating the mother and also the children, or is it the mother who's repeating that behavior? We're starting to understand that more, but we can't speak about that in an authoritative way just yet. In terms of common and compounding consequences, we see very similar consequences of the experience of violence in childhood and intimate partner violence, including to mental health, physical health, sexual and reproductive health. And perhaps not surprisingly, we see that exposure to multiple forms of violence can have what we call polyvictimization, can have a cumulative and a compounding effect in such a way that if you've been exposed to more forms of violence, you're more likely to experience more severe consequences to your health and well-being. Adolescence, as I had mentioned, is a period where these kids or young adults seem to fall through the cracks. Usually colleagues who are working on violence against children are not necessarily looking at what's happening to adolescents. And for those working on violence against women, we usually look at data starting at age 15 for girls, because most surveys that look at reproductive health start looking at kids around the age of 15. But there's a lot that we don't know about that age group in terms of what's happening around intimate partner violence during relationship formation. And at the same time, we know that that can be a period both of increased victimization and for the surveys, including from South Africa, that have looked at the perpetration of sexual violence, for instance, see that a lot of that starts at young adolescents. So it's a period where we really need to start intervening. And at the same time, we're not always looking at that age group in the way that we should. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'll keep moving. Oh, sorry, this is really important. So when we looked at this review of these risk factors, we stopped to think, so what are the opportunities that we have to start increasing coordination across these fields? And I will say, when we started looking at this, we started to use the word integrating. Can we integrate these policies or these programs? And I think that we've grown, or I will speak for myself, I have grown to look at it as a need to improve coordination. Rather than think about integration. I think that we're not necessarily at a point where we can look at integrating these efforts, but certainly there are a number of points of coordination that we can explore further. And these are some of the ones that we highlighted. They're certainly not all that we can look at, but just to spark our imagination. Certainly in terms of the implementation, the enforcement of laws. If we're looking at criminalizing abuse and exploitation, we need to both criminalize and sanction the abuse of children and women, because we know that some of the gender norms that support violence against children are the same that support violence against women. We need to start challenging those. For instance, if we are implementing initiatives to challenge norms around physical punishment of children, can we also look at those norms that deem the corporal punishment of women by their partners as acceptable and challenge both of those norms at the same time? In terms of services and response for survivors, I think that's one of the key areas. We also often have the child protection field or the violence against children field completely separate from the violence against women. And we need to understand that if you are taking care of the needs of children, but those children are going back into a household where their mother is being abused, then they're going to be affected just the same. And that if women are not leaving an abusive relationship and they may not be in a situation where can do that, or they may be making very conscientious decisions around when it is safe to do so. So the idea of removing a child from the non-abusive parent is also very difficult. The other area that we're looking at is around parenting and home visitation programs. We know that parenting has received a lot of attention lately, but many parenting programs don't even look at violence in the home against children, much less against intimate partner violence. And there's some programs that are starting to look at both of those forms of violence. And I think that that's really exciting. And in terms of economic empowerment or economic strengthening, how do we integrate a gender perspective into those efforts so that we're as effective as we can be, but that we're also not creating any harm? Because there is some evidence to suggest that if you do that economic strengthening without taking into account the gender and dynamics and power dynamics in the household, that you may create harm. And then finally, how do we close the research gaps? And that's where Office of Research Innocenti comes a little bit down the line. I'll share you some of the initiatives that we're working on. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the INSPIRE and the RESPECT frameworks. These are frameworks that are based on the best available evidence to identify what are the interventions that could help us prevent violence against children in the case of INSPIRE and violence against women in the case of RESPECT, where each letter of the word INSPIRE stands for one intervention. So I for implementation and enforcement of laws, and norms and values, and so forth. And similarly, RESPECT, also where one of each of the letters of RESPECT stands for each area of intervention for which we have some evidence to support it. So these are separate frameworks, but look what happens when I do this. Even though INSPIRE is looking at violence against children and RESPECT is looking at violence against women, they share many, if not all, of the same interventions, particularly if you take into account what they call cross-cutting areas in INSPIRE and guiding principles in RESPECT. So they both of them address the need to look at the implementation and enforcement of laws, norms and values, safe environments, parenting and caregiver support, income and economic strengthening. The empowerment of women is not explicit in INSPIRE, but I think it should be. Response and support services, education, and the need for multi-sectoral collaboration, monitoring, and evaluation. I'm going to speed up. Oh, sorry, I had my all cool animation that I didn't use, sorry. But I think, as Shanaz mentioned in the beginning, we can't be naive to think that there aren't challenges and really important tension points as we look for better coordination across these fields. And I think the way that I see it is, given what we know about the evidence of how these forms of violence intersect and some of the emerging evidence about how we can have a better and multi-pronged impact through our interventions, it doesn't seem to me that this is a choice. I think we really need to move forward towards more coordination. And in doing so, we need to tackle these tension points quite early. And some of them that I already mentioned, will children's rights take precedence over women's rights and safety? Will women, for instance, be penalized for failing to protect, which is the expression that is used in some context, when children are exposed to the violence that women themselves are experiencing? How can the legal system respond to the complexity of abuse in the family to protect all survivors, both children and women? And how can we tailor services so that they are adequate to the different age and experience of the survivors that reach them? And then finally, how can we build evidence to address these intersections and also intersections with other forms of violence that we haven't started to tackle just yet, such as youth violence? So some of the work that is happening now, I'll mention this very briefly because I think it's important for you to be aware. The Lancet has a commission that's looking at gender-based violence and youth maltreatment. So not quite the links between intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, but it's getting there. The SBRI, WHO, and Innocenti are developing a global research agenda to look at these intersections, including by developing 3 systematic reviews that we're doing with the London School of Hygiene. And we're also looking at different data sets to explore how these forms of violence intersect. So thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Alessandra, for a really wonderful presentation. I want to urge our participants, if you can put any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll attend to it after the second panel. But just want to comment on your presentation, and what stood out for me was certainly talking about co-occurrence, and it doesn't necessarily mean that violence against women and violence against children occur at the same time, but what really is important for us to acknowledge is that actually one can predispose, so the other form of violence. What we're going to have now is a short video just to look at some of, so we'll have a short video both on inspire and respect to consolidate some of what Alessandra has discussed, and then we're going to move straight into our second panel. So over to you, Garth. You're going to show the video now, and it will be probably just under 10, about 8 minutes. Okay, thanks.
Globally, 1 in 3 women will suffer physical or sexual violence during their lifetime.
Violence against women
is unacceptable,
but it is preventable.
Respect is a framework to help countries implement evidence-based strategies to prevent violence against women.
R stands for strengthening healthy relationship skills. We're calling on all countries to invest in programs that improve interpersonal communication, conflict management, and shared decision-making between partners.
E stands for the empowerment of women. And we're calling on all countries to invest in economic and social empowerment, including programs that build skills, self-efficacy, assertiveness, and self-confidence among women.
The letter S of respect stands for services ensured. We are calling on all countries to invest in health, justice, and social services for survivors of violence. Universal health coverage must include health services for women subjected to violence.
The letter P stands for poverty reduction. We must invest in strategies to reduce household poverty, including cash transfers, women's employment, and securing women's rights to assets.
The second letter E of respect stands for environments made safe. We are calling on all countries to invest in creating safe schools, workplaces, and public spaces that are free from harassment and violence.
The letter C of respect stands for child and adolescent abuse prevented. We are calling on all countries to promote nurturing family relationships, prohibit corporal punishment, and establish programs that support parents and caregivers.
The letter T of respect stands for transforming attitudes, beliefs, and norms. We're calling on all countries to invest in changing harmful gender attitudes, beliefs, norms, and stereotypes that uphold male privilege and female subordination, justify violence, and stigmatize survivors. Together,
we must demonstrate respect and prevent violence against women.
I'm committed to preventing violence against women.
I'm committed to preventing violence against women in the European region.
I am committed to preventing violence against women in the region of the Americas.
I am committed to preventing violence against women in the Eastern Mediterranean region.
I am committed to preventing violence against women in the African region.
I am committed to preventing violence against women in the Western Pacific region.
Are you? Make your commitment today.
It was really great seeing all the WHO people speaking to respect, and I'm hoping that we can, Alessandra, that with your involvement, we could perhaps do something where we integrate the two and get them to speak to both. So we're going to hand over and start the next part of our panel discussion, and I'd like to introduce firstly Elizabeth Dartnall, as most of us know her as Liz. So Liz is the Executive Director for SVRI, and she's a health specialist with over 20 years experience in research policy making, with extensive experience in researching health systems, mental health, violence against women, as well as children. She's worked in several countries in both government as well as research positions. Liz has a deep understanding of the policy process and the use of research to inform policy and practice. Since Liz has joined and managed this SVRI, it is one of the largest networks in the field of research on violence against women and children. And in fact, Liz has grown it to the extent where we now have just under 8,000 members who are part of the SVRI. Liz is a committed researcher, policymaker, feminist, as well as it wants to ensure that there's equitable, ethical partnerships in the global south. Liz and Anik are going to share this presentation, so I'm going to introduce Anik immediately as well, so that I can hand over to them. Anik Gevers is a senior research associate as well as technical specialist for SVRI. Anik began her career as a clinical psychologist specializing in child and adolescent sexual trauma, and then took on research positions that increasingly focus on developing and evaluating primary prevention programs. Currently, Anik's work focuses on research translation as well as capacity strengthening for multi-sectoral violence against women and children prevention programming across the globe, including in Southern and Eastern Africa, East Asia, the Pacific, and Arab states. So we're very fortunate to have both Anik and Liz with us this afternoon. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Shanaz, and thank you for the kind words. As I am moving into my presentation, I will want to thank the Children's Institute, the South African Medical Research Council, and Sonke Gender Justice for the invitation to this webinar series. And thank you again to the UCT support services, and thanks all of you for joining us today. It's so wonderful to be on a panel with Alessandra and Shanaz. It's really great, and of course with my co-presenter Anik. So Alessandra has shared some of the theory and the frameworks that have been developed based on the current evidence that exists. And Anik and I are now going to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges of integrating violence against children, violence against women, learning from low and middle income countries. And so hopefully we'll give a more practical application of what it might look like as we try to move together as moving forward in these two fields. So, I mean, Alessandra called this a coordinated approach, but I'm still using the clearly old language, the integrative approach. So what is an integrative approach? From our understanding, we're still really at a very early formative stage. There's no standard, widely used operational definition for such approaches. That integration overall really encompasses a broad spectrum of cooperation and collaboration across sectors, agencies, and institutions to achieve some form of cohesion to bring together prevention and response efforts, both with regards to violence against children and violence against women. And of course, it can take place at various levels. So it's a very complicated thing to try and get an operational definition around. But the Australian Social Work Journal published this definition. Integration can describe any form of interagency collaboration on a continuum of multi-agency work, from minimal work coordination through to active collaboration, and finally to services integration. So it is a complex issue, and of course, it's not easy to really unpack it. So we're going to try and provide you some examples of what it looks like on the ground. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that despite the two fields growing separately, there are really multiple intersections, as Alessandra has spoken around, and that these links do suggest the importance of working together, and that the response to one and the prevention of one is connected to the response to and the prevention of the other. And of course, then it seems obvious to program together and to program jointly, but this, of course, isn't always happening. And I think Alessandra's eloquently spoken about some of the tensions, but as far as we know, there are no currently existing evidence-based models or practices that we can present to you today. And so why is that? What are some of the tensions and realities on the ground that are causing these challenges? And I think I won't talk too much about the sort of first three, because I think Alessandra has really spoken about them. There is the risk of women's or children's needs and rights overshadowing the other, and how are mothers viewed in the context of family violence. For example, mothers involved in child welfare are often marginalised and misunderstood, while the system focuses on, and rightly so, protecting their children. But we do really, as a field, at both fields, need to develop a more nuanced understanding of women parenting in hostile environments, attend to both their needs alongside the safety and security of their children. And of course, Alessandra spoke about the adolescents. We need to integrate service. When we're integrating services, we must adopt a developmentally sensitive approach to adolescents that recognises that adolescents aren't a child anymore, but they are not yet adults. So how do we do that in sensitive ways? But of course, we're going to be talking about over the next 10 to 15 minutes when Anika presents about real examples from the ground that existing services in reality, in many of the settings in which we work, are not comprehensive or ideal for either women or children. And service providers themselves are already overwhelmed in trying to provide services to their prime clients. So when we do integrate, we need to recognise this feeling of being overwhelmed, and that service providers on the ground may not feel that they have the capacity or resources to expand their scope. So there are real tensions and there are realities, but there is some promising practice. And I'm going to hand over to Anik now to talk about some of that promising practice and to share with you some learnings from a study that she has just recently completed. So over to you, Anik.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so we in the East Asia and Pacific region, 3 agencies got together wanting to look at this question, and after thinking it through and reviewing some of the global and regional evidence, we decided to look at some very brief case studies in 4 countries, namely Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Papua New Guinea. And here we did brief country visits and various interviews and focus group discussions, and then document reviews or policy reviews. And what we wanted to look at were how existing violence against women and violence against children relevant policies, action plans, programs, services might be connected in some way, coordinated, integrated. I mean, we use sort of very broad ideas and definitions around integration, but just to see to what extent that was happening. And then how stakeholders in either fields collaborated or interacted, what the areas of tension were and where the areas of ease or convergence were, and some opportunities for further or enhanced or new collaboration or integration. You can go to the next slide, please, Liz. And the country reports haven't been finalized yet, so what I can share with you, and also just in the interest of time, is some of the overall themes of the research study findings. So first of all, a lot of the tensions are just something that's not discussed and not acknowledged, and there's a lot of misunderstanding because there's just a lot of assumptions that are made, and the misunderstandings are just not clarified, which often deepens divides and avoids solutions. And some people at various levels in each of the countries were quite unaware of the intersections or potential impact of their work on either women or their work, how their work could be impacting on children. And so that was certainly an area that could be delved into more. And we found this even when the same individuals sat on committees that were focused on violence against children, policies and protocols, and those that maybe sat on some of the women's committees. Sometimes they were the same individuals, and yet there was still a lack of making the connections and trying to see where there could be synergies. There was also quite a substantial lack of understanding on the needs of mothers and adolescents across the board. So women were often seen outside of their role as mothers, or their role as mothers was not always something that was delved into by service providers or by policymakers or researchers. So a much more nuanced understanding and approach is needed there. As Liz said earlier, we need to acknowledge that adolescents are neither big children nor little women, so they don't fit into the sort of usual way of working of either the violence against children or the violence against women field. And you know, mothers' roles or women's roles are multiple and complex. Their home or family context may be volatile and complicated, and the system in general, the systems in these different countries, and I don't think that these 4 countries are unique in the world, but the system is just not always helpful and supportive, and so their decision making is extremely challenging when there is violence towards them and or their children. And we also, something that was quite clear, and I think this is something that happens in a lot of low and middle income countries, is that donors have quite a significant influence over developments in both fields. And I think, and thus, you know, how coordination of any kind or integration of any kind is pursued or not pursued. And so if donors are not requesting joint or integrated research or programming, there's often little time, little resources, and little support to develop this area of work. And some donors will be quite specific about wanting to only look at an outcome from one particular lens. So certainly donors could think through their role in addressing this issue. Then also there was another theme that came up was what people in both fields felt was sort of tokenistic, if I can use that word, representation, or when teams or institutions felt they had in-house expertise on both violence against women and violence against children, without really understanding that the gaps in their knowledge and understanding could actually be blind spots. And so increasing true expert representation and inviting disagreement and debate and dialogue was certainly lacking, and that, you know, could actually be really helpful for the field to move forward. Then in terms of data, the forms and databases that are used to record work in cases around violence against women and violence against children were often separate. And a pretty simple thing to move forward would be to really make sure that the data collection, analysis and use is integrated and strengthened. So the forms and databases could be brought and compared and seen how to bring those together. So the initial approach to dealing with either kind of case will take into account then the women or the children in the home, depending on who the presenting client or service user is. And to understand that data from violence against women cases and research can be really helpful to violence against children work and vice versa. And so bringing that together would really be an asset. And I may sound quite pessimistic, but of course there were some pockets of promising practices, but none of these were systematically developed or implemented. It very much depended on individuals at the implementation level primarily, having the power, the motivation, and the ideas to do something, but they often would do it without an overall strategy, so it would be more of an ad hoc or case-by-case basis. But there was a lot of great interest when we were doing these visits at all levels in this topic, and it is increasingly being recognized as an important issue to address. And then the other thing that was really interesting, a lot of people assume that coordination or some level of integration, whatever that may be, means pooling resources, which at first can seem quite exciting. But then there were extensive discussions, specifically in one of the countries, that pooling resources can be great in the short term, but in the long term, we have to realize that budget cuts are inevitable. And so then eventually that pool gets smaller and smaller. So is there a way to bring resources together to really multiply and amplify effects and services and do the best thing possible for women and children at the same time, without sacrificing sort of the future size of the budget. So that's something that's really important to take into consideration. Liz, if you can go to the next slide, please. So some of the opportunities that we identified was certainly learning from joint programming successes. For example, when groups shared a very specific shared goal, so in one of the countries, violence against children and violence against women stakeholders were coming together specifically around an age of consent issue. And they all had very easily aligned goals, so it was really easy to work together. Instead of trying to take on the very broad picture and issues, they had just one very specific discrete goal that they were working on, and that was very successful. It's also really important to elevate practice-based knowledge, because there are dedicated individuals and leaders at the service and program implementation level that are finding solutions to meet the complex needs of their clients within their complex context. And so we really need to be able to document this more systematically. But we also need to acknowledge that it can be administratively and logistically challenging to do joint programming and very time consuming. The issue of accolades needs to be, and making sure that everybody receives the acknowledgement for their contributions, and that you may not be able to say what any individual stakeholder or institution contributed, what their specific contribution is, because the results may be greater than any individual one. So making sure that accolades are shared is really important, and something that came out of the different country visits. And yeah, so to move on, a shared theory of change we felt would be really helpful to the field, so that it will be about bringing people together with common understandings, highlighting common ground, common strategies, and also specifically creating a lot of clarity around how children and women's needs will be met and their rights respected, and that neither will be compromised. So this will be about bringing people together instead of trying to move one side over to the other side. And it needs to also include some sort of open dialogue process to build trust and respect, and co-develop innovative and nuanced solutions. And that will bring people together and moving together in a similar fashion. I've already talked about the expert representation, how important that is. Prevention seems to be an area with relatively less tension, because there are many shared drivers that can be addressed together, especially in multi-component programs that involve children or adolescents, caregivers, teachers, schools, or other influential people or institutions in the community. So, for example, like Alessandra was talking about, parenting programs, multi-component school and community programs, for example. So I think that's a key area of opportunity, and ensuring that that the outcomes very clearly also measure relevant violence against children and violence against women issues. Then, of course, like we said, a really nuanced approach that takes into consideration the complexities of context and capacities of adolescents and also of mothers needs to be developed. Because this is a particular area of tension between the two fields, and bringing them together. And then to also remember that the intersections, the various intersections of violence against women and violence against children that Alessandra has talked about are not the only ones. There are other layers of intersections of race, class, ability, sexuality, geography or location, and these need to be considered and be brought to the fore. And this was only done spontaneously in one of the countries that we visited. And that was really interesting to make sure that we aren't blind to other key intersections. You can move on to the next slide, Liz. Then just some concluding thoughts. Obviously, we see that integration is going to require a lot of investment and ongoing innovation, creativity, reflection, and dialogue. And really, the extent to which those in power are engaged in this issue and want a harmonized approach will impact on how much is actually explored and achieved, and also the quality of it. And thus, at the end of the day, the impact of integrative policies or services or programs, or even coordination. It may be that broader mandates, more flexible structures, and more active and trusting partnerships are also key, but that is really sort of something that we thought is more sort of what we think could help, not necessarily something that we could collect data on. And it's really important for us to build on what role models are doing, and to really document and amplify what that work is, for donors to recognize their power to influence the field and to move the field forward, to build on and bring together the respect and inspire frameworks, and put them into action, and also to use data to inform decisions, and that those data are collected on an ongoing basis, and the reflection is ongoing to see, is this way of coordination working for women and for children? So bringing people together to think this through, because there is so much passion and dedication within both violence against women and violence against children fields, and this energy and commitment could really be harnessed in the future to strengthen, innovate, and drive forward better policies, research, services, and programs for women, adolescents, and children. But we need to all be better informed and to continue to build our understanding and knowledge. And tackling the issues openly and having a solution-focused space would really be very helpful. You can go to the next slide, Liz. Thank you. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to remember that we all want, both violence against women stakeholders and violence against children stakeholders, all want the violence to stop, for perpetrators to be held accountable, and for all people to be able to live in safety and free from fear. So both fields want investment in effective and efficient programming and services, because we know that there are such limited resources in terms of time, and also, just as we said earlier, a lot of the service providers were already completely overwhelmed, and we need to bear that in mind. So we need to think about really smart and creative ways to achieve positive results. And then just to end, Liz, you can go to the next slide. The SVRI, together with UNICEF, Innocenti, and the WHO, are leading a research priority setting process for intersections, for research on intersections between violence against children and violence against women. And we are going to be facilitating a consultative process with many stakeholders in the field to identify and prioritize gaps in the research globally. And I would really encourage you to sign up for the SVRI listserv, become a member, because there will be updates throughout the process via that weekly newsletter. So hopefully, Liz, you can post that in the announcements, the link to be able to get to that. But if you just go to the SVRI webpage at svri.org, you'll be able to find that. And I just want to acknowledge that the contents of this presentation draws from a study that was supported by UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women offices in the East Asia Pacific region, and was conducted by Emma Day and myself. But that the reports are still in the process of being finalized at the regional offices, so they're not immediately available. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer questions if there's time, but I do think we're running out of time.
Thank you, Anik and Liz, for a wonderful presentation and sharing some of those really, really interesting preliminary findings that you were able to share with us, and we can't wait to see the full report. Just one of my observations that I think was really critical, and a comment that you made based on your work in the region, it's about elevating practices based on knowledge, and I think one of the comments in the chat also had been around how do you document, and how can partnerships be formed to document practices that's in, you know, and to think about. So sometimes they're community-based interventions, but you don't have a research partner and you don't feel that you're strong enough to document it. And I think that's really important, and to open up conversations about how you systematically document programs. And I think, you know, I would urge people, if you're not linked to SVRI, to do that, because the linkages you can make through SVRI is really, really important, because it's not just about institutions being research partners, but being able to link up with some of those, the thinking that's going on. I'm not going to take up space, so I know there's been a lot going on in the chat, and what I want to do is maybe to pose some of the questions that's in the chat. If we can't get to everything, we will ask the presenters to get back and to put some of the, and we can post it on the CI's website. But I'm going to take, and Naziswa, thank you for sending some of the questions to me. So I'm going to pose one of the questions to you, Alessandra, and then one to Anik and one to Liz, and then we can see how much time we have left. So one of the questions that, and I'm not sure whether you've responded to this question, Alessandra, but one of the questions was asked, have we identified protective factors or interventions, particularly with men who've experienced childhood abuse, to break the cycle of perpetration? You want to give a go at answering that?
I'm happy to, Shanaz. I think I answered all of the questions that I could on the chat, so I don't know whether you want to give the floor to another question, but I'm also happy to repeat what I said in the chat here. Sorry, I didn't mean to repeat.
Maybe just repeat quickly, and then I'll move on to Anik.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important question, and it's an area that merits more work. I think we know some of what the protective factors are, but certainly not enough. The only thing that I would say is that we need to look not just at the protective factors that can break the link between early exposure to violence and later perpetration, but also to break the link between early exposure to violence and later victimization. Because what we see now is that it tends to be, not always, but it tends to be boys who are exposed early become perpetrators and girls become victims. And that's a really, really important area of work that certainly needs more investment.
So I think very linked to that question is a next question, which Anik, I'm going to pose to you. And I think this is an anonymous person that have posed this question, and she's asking, would it not be prudent to have a family approach rather than a violence against women and violence against children approach? Because children are both girls and boys, we know, as Alessandra and I said, increase risk for perpetration and victimization later on. So what are your thoughts about whether we should rather have a family approach versus a VAC approach?
I think that there are times that a family approach can be very helpful, but I think that we also need to acknowledge that violence against women, violence against children is much broader than just the family, and that there are some situations, or when the family is held up as an ideal, there can be certain visions of what makes up a family, and that protecting a family unit becomes more of a priority than meeting children and women's needs, and that approach can often not be very helpful to women and children and keep them stuck in an abusive situation and not hold perpetrators accountable. So I think certainly it could be one of the ways that is very useful, but we need to be very careful and very aware of the sort of shadow side of that approach.
Thanks, Anik. Really, really important comment there. Liz, a question to you, and this is around the role of the media in exploiting the divide between the rights and needs of women and the rights and needs of children. Women are often painted as the abusers in most of the cases of child abuse, while men never appear to take responsibility. What are your thoughts around that comment, if any?
Thank you, Shanaz, and thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question because it raises up the issue that it's political. Violence against women and violence against children, but particularly violence against women, is a political issue. And often the people in the media or writing the stories are committed to probably ensuring that the current systems remain in place. And for them, it's important, I suppose, that to perceive the women as the perpetrator and to ignore the amount of perpetration that is perpetrated by men, which is the majority. And I agree that it's an important issue that we really need to be aware of and take note of. There are some really great initiatives out there working with the media to have a better understanding of how to report sensitively on violence against women, ensuring that we name it correctly, we name the perpetrator correctly, and we don't blame women survivors for the perpetration that they experience in the homes and in their lives. And so, what great question, and we need to do much more work with the media to ensure that we address those social norms that really drive those types of newspaper articles that we are seeing quite regularly. Thanks, Shanaz.
Absolutely, Liz, spot on. I think there's a last question, and I'm going to pose it, and I think any of you are able to take it, and it's really around adolescents, and what are some of the strategies that you might have come across that is effective in working with adolescents and reducing risks for adolescents? Anik, maybe you want to give it a go because it is an area you've worked in.
Again, I mean, there are no sort of perfect solution. I think the working with adolescents can be quite complex, and a lot of research studies are looking at a younger age group. But there are some school-based, I think that what I know best anyway, is some school-based approaches, although I do acknowledge that that often is not reaching the most vulnerable adolescents, especially those who are experiencing homelessness or who are not or able to attend school for a variety of complex reasons. So I think that those would be the ones that I would look into. I've worked on various programming, parenting programs for the adolescent time. Again, I mean, I think that there's still a lot of strengthening that needs to be done. And I think that I'll share a link to a paper on one trial that was done in South Africa that people can look at, but also the Parenting for Lifelong Health interventions is something to look at. And I see, so I just happened to have scrolled to that question as well that Alessandra mentioned, the Good Schools Toolkit in Uganda. And that may have been used with younger adolescents and sort of older children, but to look at those options as well. But I think we also need to acknowledge that the trials can be quite different. I mean, whether something's addressing intimate partner violence for adolescents or adolescents who are potentially experiencing violence in the home, or whether it's peers and bullying, it's quite a complex area. Yeah, I mean, there are some promising interventions certainly to look at. Okay.
Thank you for all the questions posed to the panelists. And we're reaching around about 4:25, and I was wondering whether from the panelist side, you had any concluding thoughts to leave to leave everyone with. It's been an incredibly rich discussion, and what I am also very clear about is that there's no magic bullet out there, that there's a lot of hard work that we still have to do. We've moved ahead in, and we've, the evidence base is starting to grow, but there's still such a lot. As we're getting evidence, we're also asking more questions and more focused questions, but I think that's really, really important. But in terms of, from your perspective, just closing remarks, shall we start with Alessandra? Any closing remarks from your side for participants today?
Sure. I think the point that you mentioned, Shanaz, which has also been brought up in the chat, I'm reminded of 25 years ago when I started working in the area of violence against women and in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I went to a conference in the US on the topic, and I thought I'm going to find out everything that I need to know and what I need to do and adapt. And I got there and nobody had the answers either. And I think that can be frustrating. If you came to this webinar thinking that we're going to give you the answer, coordinate these programs and fix the situation, it can be frustrating not to have that. But that's where we are at the moment. And I think that highlights, one, the importance of us reaching out and collaborating with colleagues perhaps that we have not collaborated with before, across fields, across sectors, and two, really being careful about documenting our learning. And I know there was the comment in the chat. I think when you're providing services to survivors, monitoring and evaluation can seem like a luxury that you just don't have the time or the funds for. Donors not always want to fund rigorous evaluations. But I think that because we are where we are in the field and we really need to build these lessons, and the risk of harm is real to both children and women and men, that we really need to look for those partnerships that will allow us to document what we're doing so that we are contributing to building the evidence base so that 5 years from now we are in a much different position. So I will plug the SVRI too. I think the SVRI forum that takes place every 2 years has been really instrumental in bringing these two communities together. Liz can talk about it more, but we see a clear trajectory across the forum where more and more colleagues from the violence against children and child protection field have come, and having those dialogues, having those opportunities to get to know each other is truly important. So those are my parting remarks, and to thank you again, Shanaz, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Alessandra. Liz, over to you. Any concluding thoughts from your side?
Thank you for the webinar. I think it's really exciting, and I think it's wonderful to be talking about the two frameworks that we have in one conversation. And I think it really does help us move forward as a field to be talking about how important these frameworks are, but also how much they are interlinked. And it is incredible to, as the slide that you showed, Alessandra, about how much they are interwoven and how together we really should be moving forward. But being cognizant of the importance of having open dialogue, of the challenges that we face in doing so, and the amazing work that is going on the ground. And so again, just to give a plug for practice-based learning, to learn from the people that are doing the work on the ground and help that guide the next steps. And just to add to, thanks for the kind words about the forum. It is a really great space, and the SVRI over the next couple of years, led by Anik, will be looking at ways in which we can expand and strengthen our work if needed in the area of violence against children, and to look at those intersections more closely and use the forum as a real important space to have open, healthy dialogues around the tensions that have been raised. And I think it was great to have really open discussions around those tensions. They exist, they are real. And to move forward, we have to have them. And so please think about the SVRI Forum as a space to come and present your great work on research, and to think about ways in which we can have more intense, helpful discussions around bringing these two fields together and working much more in, and I'm going to take your word, Alexandra, in a coordinated way. And again, thanks for the webinar. It's been terrific. And that are my final words for the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Anik, over to you.
Thank you, Shanaz. And yeah, I want to also say thank you for shining a light on this issue and really giving a platform for this discussion to happen. I think it's really important, and for everyone to sort of wade into what can seem like quite a messy space, but actually I think there are many opportunities for us to bring the work together and improve coordination in different ways, and move towards integration that makes sense. And I mean, I think what I keep holding on to is that we all want the same thing at the end of the day. We all want this violence to end. And so even if we have differences of opinion how to get there, if we just remember that actually we all want the same thing. And I think another thing that we all have in common is we don't want to cause any harm. So being able to have those discussions, understand that this is our common ground, I think can help us to move forward. And also I'd like to encourage anyone who's out there who's listening, if you feel like you have an innovative idea that has not been documented somehow, please do find a blog. I mean, you're welcome to contact the SVRI help desk and see whether we can help really amplify your practice-based knowledge and expertise, and to put it out there so we can start documenting innovative solutions and start learning from them. You don't have to wait for the forum, although the forum's amazing, but we want to also share learning through all the time. So please do be in touch with us, and we can see whether or not we might be a space to be able to share your learning and your innovation and creativity.
Last but not least, but to say thank you for the three of you for an amazing afternoon of just being able to discuss this. I would have hoped that we could do this in person, but perhaps next time we can. I'm also hoping that what you shared today, and I know, Liz, you brought this up, potentially you could be doing a blog on this, and I think there'd be a lot of interest. So challenge, shall we do a blog? Yeah. Good, wonderful. But I think this afternoon just sparked a lot of interest in me, and it's something that I've been really interested in. So I'm hoping that participants that joined us today will also join us in a week's time, and we'll continue the conversation around interventions. And yeah, are we still on? Yes.
Yes,
so sorry for that technical glitch. But thank you all once again, and I hope everyone can join us next week for another conversation, and this time particularly focusing on interventions. Thank you. Over to you, Garth. Thank you all.
Prevent the violence against women. Yeah, it's time that we make a change. Maybe we can reconnect, find a new purpose and a new definition of the word respect. R is for relationship, skills that we can strengthen. E is for empowerment, empowerment of all women. S is for services ensured. B for poverty reduction. E for environment, making sure that it's safe. We cannot forget this. C for children and adolescents, and for abuse prevention. T is for transformation, changing norms. I hope that you're with this. Time to make a change. We cannot forget. Can't be passive. Gotta put in action. Time for respect. Yeah. Time to make a change. We cannot forget. Can't be passive. Gotta put in action. Time for respect. RESPECT about gender equality. Big decision making with World Health Organization. RESPECT about gender equality. Big decision making with World Health Organization.